For a conversation on why inclusive growth matters, please welcome Stacey Warden, Executive Director of Global Market Development at the Milken Institute, Bhaskar Chakravorti, Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and here to lead the conversation is Financial Times Editor-at-Large, columnist, and editorial board chair, Gillian Tett.
Well, thank you and welcome to the next session, which is really a chance to react to the two very powerful keynotes we just heard about why inclusive growth matters and some ideas of what can be done to try and promote it. And we have two veterans of this debate here today to talk about this, which matters enormously. I'd like to start with you, Stacey. I was very struck earlier when Ajay was talking about how he sees the changing climate today. He pointed out that the BRT statement, the Business Roundtable statement that came out recently was striking, but it's just a step on the road. I'm curious, at Milken you oversee the intersection between the public and private sector. You have a lot of business people who are very involved with your group. Do you think they're taking the need to promote inclusive growth seriously, and why should they?
The first thing to know about the Business Roundtable statement was that, some people have dismissed it, but actually it was a year in the making.
A year?
Yeah, and it's very hard to kind of herd all of those cats to come together on one statement, and they were very involved at the CEO level. This is not something that they outsourced to their staff. They read it, they were very careful about the wording of it, and they really did take it seriously. And, some were at the forefront, and some were perhaps motivated to join just by kind of a peer pressure idea. But they would not have signed that, I think, even 5 years ago, right? There has definitely been such a change. And look, not every company is a Mastercard or a Unilever or a Salesforce, but more and more we are seeing interest at the Milken Institute in these kinds of issues and more engagement around these kinds of issues. So, it starts, I think, also with a bottom of the pyramid kind of mentality, right? There's money to be made there. It's not good for business to have environmental degradation. Happy employees and healthy employees are more productive employees. It's a doing well by doing good kind of mentality for sure, but I think it's there.
Right, it's very interesting. By the way, I should echo, I do think there's been a big change in the zeitgeist. One of the reasons I'm here today is because we launched this thing at the FT called Moral Money, which is basically a platform to look at all things ESG. It's a web page and a newsletter. And we launched it 3 months ago in a slightly experimental fashion to see whether there was going to be interest. And the interest has been so explosive that against all expectations in the first 3 months, it's turned into the most successful new product we've ever launched at the FT. Extraordinary. Yeah. But do you see a sea change in sort of mentality in the C-suite and amongst the people you speak to?
Yeah, I definitely see the change. And part of the challenge for a Mastercard or a Unilever or any of the companies that whose names come up over and over again in fora such as this is that they don't want to be in a situation where they stand alone within their industry. So they forge ahead and they commit to financial inclusion or inclusion of other kinds, and their competitors are kind of potentially benefiting from that without making the investments. So what initiatives like the Business Roundtable or what the FT is doing is that it's creating this groundswell of a conversation and a narrative around businesses taking this larger role in society and potentially giving CEOs the courage to kind of say, okay, I'm not going to deliver this the recurring promise of a quarterly expectation from the analysts, and we're going to take the long view. So it's not just the Unilevers of the world, but every other consumer product company then feels that they need to kind of step up to that. And so there are no free riders. And we do see this narrative changing, but it's changing slowly.
Right.
I mean, it's a little bit in our DNA because this is frankly how Mike Milken made his money. I mean, he did have this insight, right, that if the coupon was higher than the risk premium, then it was still a good investment. But also, he sort of looked around in the 1970s, and the only companies that were getting funded were being funded by equity or they were investment grade. And he just went around picking up money on the ground because he was willing to fund, Jewish people and women and African Americans. He funded the first African American billionaire and God forbid, Australians, And so
The Australians were really scraping the barrel,
mean,
below even the British.
Yeah. And, this is really how he was just a little bit blind to all of the sort of snobbiness that was going on in the 1970s marketplace.
But I'm curious, to what degree, though, do you think that it's still possible to put inclusive growth as something which is partisan in a political sense? I mean, is this something that people on the right and the left should care about?
Well, look, I would like to suggest that non-inclusive growth has not actually gone that well. At a global level, at a sovereign level, and at a domestic level, right? I mean, look, let me just start from sort of the top and work my way down a little bit. Look at Japan, for example. This is a country that has not been able to generate growth for, almost 2 decades, right? They have been fighting deflation for a decade. That 28% of that country is over 65 years old. They have tried everything. What they need is immigration. Are they going to try immigration? A little inclusivity, a little productivity from Asians around them, Malaysians and Filipinos and whatever, and they could have growth. Are they willing to try it? Maybe some tentative steps this year, right? The history of the United States, forget, sort of the old history, but even the history since World War II. We had laws that said African Americans can only move where they already are. And that led to overcrowding in cities, and it led to white flight into the suburbs, and it led to the car culture. And it led to, was that a good growth strategy for us? I would suggest that it was not, I mean, if we had, the financial crisis, was that, I will suggest to you that the US financial system is a little testosterone heavy, shall we say. And if that was just a little bit more inclusive, and I want to argue against this idea that inclusion means we get to invite people to our party. Our party is good, and we're going to be really good, and we're going to invite them to it. No, inclusion means and is beneficial if we understand that the party is only a good party if all of these people are included, and they can add things and make things better. So, if the financial sector had a few more voices in it saying, care about Main Street, or let's be a little bit more cautious, we would have all been in a better place. And if you look at the last 2,000 years of growth, if there was a little bit more inclusion, a little less social hierarchy, a little more ability to work with other religions, we probably could have had the internet in the 1300s.
Well, which is a good segue to ask, though. We could have had the Shakespeare on the internet from the get-go. The mind boggles. But it's a good way to bring in Bhaskar and say that, a lot of people assume that the internet is sort of automatically something that's going to connect everyone and create more inclusion and create more growth. Is that true?
Well, it is certainly an important force for inclusion because it gives people access to a means for communication, for getting access to resources, for connecting with others. So it's got all those positive elements, and then you can build a business on top of an internet platform and scale up the business, and lots of good things can happen. And that business can be built not just by Mark Zuckerberg, but by a kid in inner city Detroit. So the internet is a force for democratizing entrepreneurship and democratizing your voice and your ability to play a role in society. Now, at the same time, the kid who does manage to become the next Mark Zuckerberg does, kind of distance himself or herself from everybody else because the internet is such a powerful force for, building a business and potentially creating these enormous societal gaps. So the internet simultaneously is a democratizing force, but it's also a separating force. It has been responsible.
It makes people stinking rich.
It does make people
Or healthily rich.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. And then the other challenge with the internet, as we are realizing, we're kind of now have gone through multiple waves of our relationship with the internet, and the last couple of years have been, a sense of realization that the internet comes with its own challenges, such as what's happening with all the data that we are submitting into the internet, and who owns that data. And essentially, that data is valuable when it's concentrated in the hands of a few because of the network effects and all that, so on and so forth. So again, that ability for the internet to concentrate power is something that we should keep an eye on because it is a non-inclusive phenomenon. And I think it's both good and bad.
But it's worth picking up on that because, of course, the last time you saw this rapid technology shift leading to massive concentrations of power and wealth in America was, as Raj showed earlier, back during the Gilded Age, the Rockefeller years, when, of course, it took government action to try and remedy that in response to crises. Do you think that's where we're heading, or do you think that simply talking about inclusive growth is going to be enough? Is it going to require government action, more regulation, more redistribution?
So I guess the question is government action in what areas? There is a lot of talk of government action on the tech sector, and largely because the outcome of the 2016 elections has kind of got everybody worried about what this industry is doing to society and to the democratic process. That said, my concern is that much of government action is going to be done without a clear understanding of the dynamics of technology. So the regulators themselves need to keep up with the pace of change. And that is very difficult to do. So if I were a betting person, I would say there's going to be a lot of talk about it. There's going to be action that'll be taken. But eventually, it will result in the market finding a solution to these issues. And in the past, that's kind of what we have seen. When you look at the cases of Microsoft or IBM, or even an earlier version of the AT&T and the Bell system, it was the threat of government action that galvanized these companies to make a change and galvanized new entrants to come in. And essentially, the market really kind of understands the dynamics of technology and kind of resolves the issue. So government action will happen, but I think it's more from the perspective of a threat rather than an actual, breakup of the industry.
Right. Stacey, from your point of view, looking at ways to try and promote more inclusive growth, I mean, do you think it's time to talk seriously about, say, redistribution, even on the West Coast?
I think we definitely need redistribution, and I would not shy away from saying that. But I think it's a little bit trickier now than it was kind of in the days of the robber barons, because then those guys were locking in a monopoly on the railroads. Nobody else could use the railroad. AT&T was $10 a phone call to Japan. Whereas these platforms are also lowering the cost structure considerably for other entrants, right? So they are concentrated, but they are also quite inclusive. So people making money selling things on eBay, people making money on Facebook, people making money using the Uber platform and TaskRabbit and what it is. So you need to be very careful about kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater on some of these large platforms. But yeah, so maybe I'll stop there for that. But I do think these notions of inclusion are getting expanded in part because of these platforms. So, for example, and Shamina Singh has done some really interesting work on this idea of data inclusion and data as an asset, which is a form of financial inclusion, but it's a little bit different. And these platforms are what kind of enable that to take place, right?
Right. I'm curious, I mean, just before I talk about some of the other aspects of this, what do you make of the recent call by the OECD to essentially have redistribution through another name between countries in terms of looking at taxation of big companies and big tech companies around the world? I mean, do you think that's, Bhaskar, do you think that's a good way to go in terms of trying to get more inclusion between countries and a sort of more equitable situation? Well,
I'm not quite sure how one acts on that, because the tech companies, for one, the tech companies are a combination of companies that are headquartered in the United States. There's another hub that is emerging out of China. And then there are a number of tech companies that are sort of coming up across the world with individual, somewhat dispersed centers across Asia and Africa. So I'm not quite sure how one does redistribution through taxation across countries. I don't understand that.
Well, one idea that's been sort of batted about by Brad Setzer and others is to think about, right now we tax mostly on production, but also to start thinking about taxing where most of the consumption takes place. So you can't have your one shell company in Ireland, another one in Bermuda or wherever it is, and have all your consumption take place in the United States, that you're going to have to be taxed on where that business activity is. I think ideas like that are actually very interesting.
But I mean, the idea is that you would potentially then give more money back to not just some countries, which currently don't get it in the developed world, but also in the developing world. And
right, all of these philanthropists, not to lump everybody together, but the philanthropy to Africa that does not happen with some kind of tax. It is not enough to want to do well in Africa and not want to be a citizen of those countries, pay taxes there, and support those governments through business activities. That kind of regime where you keep all of your profits in Switzerland or in the Cayman Islands or whatnot, that kind of regime definitely has to go away.
Because I mean, what we've had until now is, as you say, that kind of situation where people are essentially keeping the taxes in non-high tax areas, but then trying to make up for it with philanthropy, which, as we've heard earlier, is not the most effective way forward.
Right.
To what degree do you think the Sustainable Development Goals are one way to move the conversation forward in terms of framing the problem?
So I think the Sustainable Development Goals are, it's a laudable project. It's a big, perhaps an overloaded framework, but it sort of covers the waterfront of issues. So the good thing that the Sustainable Development Goals has done is that it has brought this wide range of issues to the forefront. It gives a framework for different participants of society to have a conversation and identify, what role they can play in addressing these gaps that need to be closed. And these gaps are not going to be closed by a single sector. It's going to be a combination of public and private and social. It also gives us a sense of how much money it's going to take in order to close these gaps. There are a variety of estimates that have been developed. Somewhere between $3 to $5 trillion a year need to be invested to get to those goals between now and 2030. And of course, that number is going up because we're falling further and further behind. Now, this framework also helps us figure out how much money can be expected from governments or through redistribution efforts. And somewhere between $1 to $1.5 to $2 trillion can be expected from the public sector. So now we are still left with a gap. Now, a number of organizations, the Business Commission for Sustainable Development and several others have made some estimates that if companies were to invest in these areas with an eye towards their commercial interests, the commercial value that can be generated for companies across the board is somewhere between $12 to $15 trillion in investing in SDG hotspots. So at a macro level, the Sustainable Development Goals give us a business case for private action and public action. And so I think it's a start. The problem is this is great on paper at a macro level. How do we get the companies at a micro level, at an individual managerial and CEO level to recognize, okay, this is what we need to do. This is the investment that we need to make as part of that, whatever remains out of the 3 to 5 trillion.
Stacey.
And it's not, I think, look, companies, there's not a company report out there now without the Sustainable Development Goals. You check, I'm 5 and 12 and I'm 3 and 17. And, it's very helpful in that way. But I think that Ajay made a good point that it is just a really big problem. We have to think about it in a really big problem. And it's also a kind of a policy problem. It's not just about companies. And I think of it as kind of two paths. And I think about it globally. And I think about it demographically. And if you think of, Japan, where 28% of that country is over 65. And you think about the median age in Europe and North America, which is, by the way, the median age in Europe is 43 years old. So median is not average. Medium is the midway point, right? The median age in Asia is a little bit lower than that, and the median age in North America, I think, is 40. The median age in Africa is 18. 18. Half the people on that continent are below 18 years of age. And that continent is going to create something like 450 million people by 2030 that are of working age population. What are those people going to do? What path are we going to be on broadly? I think the SDGs are important, but basically we can pick one of two paths. One path, which is more, let's call it the exclusionary path, where is a world of rapid urbanization, slums and overcrowding, infrastructure that can't keep up, environmental degradation, and massive migration north. Or we can think of it, because Africa will be the engine of growth for the world for the next 50 years. Or it can be a path where we have a path, let's call it the inclusion path, where Africans are part of the global supply chain, where they are an important, $7 trillion by some estimates, consumer opportunity, consumption opportunity for companies, where they are productive members of a global society. And I think we just need to pick broadly, and I'm just using Africa as an example, but you can think about this for developing countries as a whole. What path do we want to put this world on? The exclusion path, which is not going to benefit anybody, or an inclusive path, which will benefit, hopefully, everybody. And that, I think, is broadly the choice in front of us right now.
Yeah. If I just want to make one more plug for the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm no fan of the structure of the goals because I do believe it's kind of overloaded. However, it has created an opportunity for the private sector to participate in all these issues relating to inclusion and sustainable development in a public manner. And thereby find those points of collaboration with governments and with the social sector.
Well, someone who's trained as a journalist and was previously an anthropologist, I've always been fascinated by how the zeitgeist changes, how the cognitive map changes, how ideas that used to seem completely far-fetched and out in sort of hippieville eventually become more mainstream. And I do think the fact we're having this conversation today, the work that you're doing, the fact that we've had such an uptake in the FT Moral Money platform shows that the zeitgeist is indeed changing. So, as you said, Stacey, the challenge now is really how do we go ahead and do that? And that's, of course, what the rest of the day is going to be dedicated towards. So, thank you very much indeed, and best of luck to all of you in figuring it out.
Okay, thank you.